Thank you very much. That was an outstanding. I mean, I think we really covered a lot of ground in terms of the different aspects and even some of the strides that have been made in terms of better inclusion of multimorbidity and polypharmacy of older adults into clinical trials. There was, I have a few questions and many questions have now come in from the audience. But I think I was really struck by the slide that Heather presented on coverage decisions in terms of the gulf between the study population ages departing from the Medicare age population. And I think that came up in a few other comments. So it seems to me that basically sounds like we are not evidence-based in terms of our policy making or decision making. So can we develop better ways to present and evaluate maybe and perhaps new guidelines for recommendations? You think about strobe guidelines for observational studies. Is this something where we could actually display that data and in terms of the trial population, juxtapose that with the actual user population and make some thoughtful kind of a priori guidelines or thresholds? I guess that's to Heather, but that was touched on by definitely by Raji and Stuart as well. So I'd love to get some thoughts.
I think it could be quite interesting too. I was kind of looking very broadly, but you could really then start to apart and see which sorts of classes of drugs, individual drugs, etc., really show more evidence of efficacy, and really then look at coverage. When we were talking, the first panel kind of brought up the idea of carrots. And so I think a real carrot is showing benefit in the population that's going to be covered by Medicare as a type of insurer. And there's no reason other insurers wouldn't want to also know if a pharmaceutical or device is going to be efficacious in their patient population.
Looking about coverage and things, which I don't know if anyone mentioned, I may have missed it, is financial toxicity. And the oral chemotherapy, the oral anti-cancer drugs are, as you know, are extraordinarily expensive. I mean, it's if someone has a drug plan with a reasonable copay, that's fine. And fortunately, I mean, I work in an area where that's true, but I'm sure that's not true most of the places. But it's not unusual for the drugs to cost $10,000, $12,000 a month if you had to pay out of pocket. So it's great to have new drugs, but accessibility and the issue about financial toxicity is extremely important.
Raji, what are your thoughts about, all these, but it's all germane. I mean, really finding out ways that in terms of accessibility to the actual medication when it for the population that will be prescribed it, improving information about the evidence of how well it functions, but as well as if they can access it. Those are all related. Raji, any thoughts on how we can kind of harmonize?
Yeah. So, the clinical trials, as I said, particularly in oncology, the only thing, the inclusion criteria just says 18 years and older. And when we approve the product label doesn't say that it cannot be administered in older population. It's for all adults. So there is nothing to stop to pay for older adults. But still the treating physician may not have all the information to treat that patient because that patient was not studied. That's a separate issue. But the product label itself is quite broad. It doesn't say you have to treat only this particular ethnicity group or what have you. It will just show that, okay, these are the patients studied, but the indication itself is for a broader population.
Great point. I guess this next question is for Jason. So, knowing that basically through your surveys that being thoughtful and intentional about how we're going to better integrate patients, and that they really do care, that there's a level of interest that affects their willingness to participate in trials. If we are trying to get more patients that are kind of by the standard thought more frail based on multimorbidity and polypharmacy, what can we use to try to modulate that, in knowing that, hey, we really do need to they may think that they don't qualify based on some of the things they hear that are rather broad brush. But what can we do deliberately to try to improve that if we can kind of gain that information about multi-diseases and polypharmacy?
So I think there's sort of an empirical theme to your question, which is, given a specific disease and a specific patient population, a group of older adults, what do we know about how they perceive the risks and the benefits, the barriers, the burdens of that study? And in the background, of course, is what are their attitudes about trust, altruism, and research? So that research is out there in some diseases. And, I guess the charge to this group, or as a next step, would be to look a little closer at that literature. How much do we know about the attitudes of a 75-plus-year-old with bone-on-bone arthritis on 5 medicines with heart failure, about her willingness to be in a heart failure study, and what would she see as the barriers to enrolling in it? What would she see as the upsides? Those are all empirical questions. They're all testable. The conceptual models are there. It's just a question of doing the work.
And the other panel have comments on?
I think
So
it's
one more thing
that we're talking about. I totally agree with Jason and the willingness to be a part of a trial, but we never say really in the clinical encounter, are you willing to be on a drug when you have bone-on-bone arthritis, you're taking 5 other drugs, and this drug has never been tested in someone like you? And I have no idea how it's going to work. And I think that's the challenge that providers are faced with. And they can't know how many people, like the patient that they're encountering, that the drug has been tested in. And there is no sort of, even, the major medical journals are not requiring from these a variety of trials, any sort of stratification of results. So it's very hard for the clinician to know if the drug would work. And so I would say flip it around. We're not saying this drug was never tested on you, but it was tested in a lot younger people. They probably weren't taking all the medicines you are, but I'm going to prescribe it, and then you're going to have a cost, like Dr. Lichtman brought up, that you just got to go figure out how to cover yourself. I'm the doctor. I don't know your copays. Good luck. And so I'd say, we should really be thinking both sides of things so that doctors can be more informed and the recipients, the patients are also more informed.
Raji, you had a comment?
So, it may be a good idea to look at studies where they were able to enroll patients, older patients, 75 and older, and see what was different in those studies. Why did patients, go and enroll in these studies? I presented one example where, yes, this is an age-related macular disease, and it happens to be only in that age group patients, but definitely they did come in numbers and entered into the study. So what was it that made that study successful? And, I think we can learn from some of the studies where they were able to enroll more patients.
Some of the more successful cancer clinical trials in older patients included, one, you didn't have a placebo randomization. That was one thing. Or the randomization wasn't like oral therapy versus surgery. Some crazy randomization with the differences are massive. But the things that really worked were either patient or physician choice of therapy. That your treatment wasn't totally random, and that you had some input, or your doctor had some input into what you were getting. And there was a breast cancer adjuvant study that was hugely successful over the age of 65. And there was a ovarian cancer trial also, where there was some physician and patient choice in the randomization. So it wasn't just a flip of a coin. It was been, I think even younger patients would find that more acceptable. But this was in patients over the age of 65. And both studies proved very well.
there are designs, they've been around for a while, they take into account preferences, there's analytic approaches to analyzing the preference design. So I think we have to think more broadly than the traditional parallel group RCT. And in the afternoon, we'll be hearing more about different trial designs, in-home trials. So I think that's a place for viewers and participants to learn more about the conduct of those trials.
And trials, as Jason mentioned, trials closer to people's homes with transportation wasn't a huge issue. And so the caregiver burden was a little bit less, maybe. I think that would also help. You can't expect these patients or someone in their family to drive them an hour or two each direction and spend a huge amount of money on transportation, parking, etc. I mean, driving into New York City is like, you can't even imagine. People who live here don't like it. And to get a patient to do that, park for $50 and it's just terrible. It's really, I think when these budgets are put together, some allocation has to be made to help the patients out. I don't think we're paying the patients to be on the study. I think we're just making it, we're leveling the playing field of who's able to participate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge component is what we're learning in all aspects of health, but particularly maybe in this population is social determinants are such a huge factor, and that we particularly need to think about, as Jason described, with just making it more simplistic and easier for those that are interested. We need to increase the pie of those that are willing, but even for those that are willing, to try to be intelligent about how we design their access.
One of the things we looked at,
one
of the things we looked at, we actually calculated in one of our studies, we calculated by MapQuest the distance that it would take someone to drive to get to Penn, and looked at that and did that predict willingness, and it didn't. It was really, the travel was a subjective experience. That is to say, it wasn't just the mileage, it was the hassle factor. Because I agree, Stuart, driving 2 miles into New York is like driving 80,000 miles in Kansas or whatever.
Like light years.
Yes, to the moon and back.
There's a question from the audience. It says, can the FDA or other health authorities request post-market research for conducting studies in older patient populations? Maybe Raji first, but then the rest of the panel can certainly field that, I think.
I think this is something on the table now, and at least in oncology, they're trying to see if this can be post-marketing commitments rather than requirements, and because these patient population were not studied, and we are uncertain about the efficacy and safety of these patients. So under that, we can only request, but it's again left to the pharmaceutical companies to conduct that trial. But this is still on the table.
This is a favorite topic of mine because I've been involved in this kind of issue for 20, 30 years already. I've heard that suggestion for 20, 30 years already. I've never seen it happen. And I'm very skeptical. I'm very cynical about that because I've seen people try. I've tried. Other people more better positioned than I am have tried. We talk about it. I've been in. I could go on and on about the meetings. Talk about carrot and stick. The only way it's going to happen is if you have a carrot and a bomb, and it's not, a stick won't do it. You have to be but I don't know if they're willing to do that. Yeah. I've heard this so long. Parallel design, people with dysfunction. I've heard it all, and there hasn't been one trial. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's been one trial that's done any of that. The FDA hasn't required. I understand the issues involved. I'm not trying to be hypercritical of the FDA, not in the least. But I'm just saying it just hasn't happened, and maybe someone smarter than I could help, but I've heard that so many times. I can't.
I guess maybe to Heather, is this something that needs to be? Perhaps it's not going to be fielded from the FDA regulatory, but maybe this is a coverage decision kind of issue where we've seen that modify treatment utilization.
Coverage, because that's why I had the slide about the two arms of the payers. It's really expensive to get a drug to market. And I want to acknowledge that fully. So the pharmaceutical companies are under immense pressure. They're doing really good work and they're doing very hard work.
Absolutely.
But the problem is the cost of the adverse drug reactions that we're seeing across the different ages, but specifically in high-risk populations. Those are being borne upon the insurers, and because Medicare is the most common insurer of older adults, those are the taxpayers. And so the insurers and taxpayers should really have quite an investment in wanting to find out if drugs are safe and effective in both combinations with other drugs, in combinations with other conditions for which they're not the primarily prescribed, as well as other sorts of outcomes. So I think that there's your carrot and there's your stick in one thing. Do you want to pay for something that may be hurting somebody?
I don't want to belabor this. I'm just to say most of these trial recommendations for this data that we're looking for is not tens of thousands of patients. Yeah. Most of these post-marketing things Raji couldn't tell me the numbers. I don't know the numbers, but we're not talking about thousands. We're not talking about redoing the clinical trial. We're not talking about thousands of patients. Maybe we're talking about 50 patients or 100 patients. In the scheme of a drug, from a clinician point of view, I'm prescribing a drug that costs $12,000 a month. I have very little sympathy that they can't do a study with 50 or 100 patients of the people who are going to use the drug that they're going to make the money on.
Yeah. I guess this is a way to segue to methods, perhaps off that comment. Do we need to, in terms of if we would want to do better inclusion? I think we've talked about, Raji, in your slides, inclusion of a small set of older adults in early phase trials, and then that gives you a beachhead to expand that in later trials. In terms of design and empowering of those studies, is that something we also, in terms of a potential additional setback, is that another one that we need to be cognizant of? Is basically just the beta in these studies, or that's assailable?
See, what I was saying was you can do the early study so that you are comfortable in taking more patients in the registrational study. And at least you will have that information. You can do this sequentially. You can do that first in a more homogeneous, not so high risk group, and then do the dose study in older adults. But even in the randomized trial, what we are saying is, okay, we will look at the primary population as you're restricted this homogeneous population without these high-risk group as the primary evaluation population for risk-benefit. However, we want the other patients to be included in that so that at least we will know what happened to them for future patients who are going to get treated. Understand that, as was pointed out, that many times there is a barrier to enrolling in clinical trials, that we know that not many people may enroll in clinical trials, and particularly the older adults. If we can get some data, it's better than no data. Okay.
Maybe this question would be best for Jason to take first. This is from one of our steering committee panels, Alex London. So how should we decide which trials to do, given the drugs are often approved from studies in relatively narrow populations? So it's that component of it's certain patients that we studied it in, but it certainly is likely going to be used in more. But again, so studies are often approved from studies in relatively narrow populations, and there are uncountably many additional populations in which that drug might be tested. More questions than trials to answer them. So in terms of when we think about, I guess, the population that indication is based on, and then bolstering that to other populations, what what are some of the considerations we need to think about?
Well, I would think, I'm actually more thinking, there's two avenues to answer that question. One's a scientific one in some sense, which is, to what degree do we think that the disease has significant clinically meaningful variation depending on age, because of any number of things like pharmacology. But the other is, I think, in our question, I sense potentially a kind of a process or a political matter, which is, who decides these things? What social structure do we have set up that can kind of be a gatekeeper to sort of set the tone about what's appropriate? NIH has cooperative study groups, which more and more emphasize academic industry partnerships. Certainly in the Alzheimer's space, it's become more and more that has become more and more, for example, the case, to give one area that I'm quite familiar with. Are those the venues within which we kind of create the cultural norm about, how could you not study this in the population versus population studying is acceptable? Because what I'm sensing when I listen to this conversation is that the current political process structures don't seem to be adequate, that there doesn't seem to be, if you will, a third branch of government to help take this on, if you will. We've only got the two branches and we need the third.
Right, and they often conflict. Yeah, those two branches that we...
Right. I don't think any group here is a bad actor. It's just that each group has, I think, as Heather has pointed out, each group has its interests and its priorities. And I'm sensing that we don't yet have a group, and I use the word group with a small g, an entity, a structure that puts together some of the considerations that are here. Heather, I think, has highlighted that. There's the payers, but they're late in the game, and then there's the people who develop the drugs who have their own interest, and then FDA has it sort of limited its slice of authority. I haven't helped with what that answer is, but I think what I might have done with Alex's question is identified, if you will, that kind of process policy authority gap.
We've got another comment that came in, or question that came in from one of our steering committee panelists. So most products being developed do have quite large safety margins. Are we overplaying unintended safety consequences out of habit rather than following thoughtful discussions? I think anybody on this committee could take a stab at that. But maybe Stuart, since I feel like that you with your creatinine clearance, that made that abundantly clear, that using creatinine clearance as a limitation for something that's not renally cleared is kind of a head scratcher. I sort of get it, but yeah.
I think that's just traditional, the way we've cut and paste for so many years. No one's really stopped to think about it. I think we've all been a little bit guilty of that. And I think, as I said, the molecularly driven studies have changed that. But I don't know if the more, chemotherapy, I guess, is, or even the molecular studies, there's a lot of toxicity. So there's a lot of safety issues with the drug. So I don't know if that's really true, that at least from what I do, that the margin is so broad. I don't see it that way. Every drug I give everybody has a side effect that's I have to be careful about. So we do have to be very careful. The creatinine clearance issue is an issue, and I think that could help a lot. And the prior malignancy issue, I think, could help a lot to get more older patients get more patients on study, but particularly older patients. And it won't affect toxicity of the outcomes. We looked at this in breast cancer. We a priori dose modified renally excreted drugs based on creatinine clearance, and we showed at the end that it didn't affect outcome, toxicity, anything. So at least it gave us some feeling that we were in the right direction. But I think a cancer drug is different maybe than a drug for hypertension or cholesterol. We look at it differently.
Right. I think that's kind of the mantra, is that we need to, a lot of these can't be put into just large buckets. I think we're at time, so I really want to thank the panel for an outstanding dialogue that's shed a lot of light on a lot of different challenges, but I think we've definitely mentioned some great potential solutions, or things that we can apply to get to those solutions. So thank you so much to this group. we'll take a 20-minute break, and then we will move to, let's see, that at Dr. Bob Temple will open the second panel of session 2, Alternative Study Approaches. That's to talk about helpful insights that might be able to carry over to the clinical trial context to improve better inclusion of older adults in clinical trials. And with that, we will take our break. Thank you so much.